We are on, and welcome to our podcast, Exhibit A. And once again, I have my partner, Casey Marticoreno, with us.
Good morning, Dawn.
How are you today?
I'm great, thank you.
The reason why I asked that is that you've been extremely active lately in trial doing domestic violence cases, which is why I wanted to talk to you today. As you know, today or this month is Domestic Violence Awareness Month.
That's right.
And, I don't think a lot of people know that there's such a thing. There's so many holidays and special months that we've recognized various things. I didn't know that there was such a thing as Domestic Violence Awareness Month until I became a family law attorney. When did you learn that there was such a thing?
Until I became a family law attorney.
So, Casey, you've been in court a real lot. I know that, the experience of preparing for trial is a draining one. And, how are you feeling today on this Friday? You get a little bit of time off today. Are you okay?
I feel great today. As you know, we had an event last night with our local judges. We had a great time networking with them, talking with them, and also learning a lot about picking their brains, judicial perspective on how lawyers behave. And my biggest takeaway from last night was they're watching how your credibility, how you speak, how you behave, how you interact with your opposing counsel. I think that was an amazing.
It was very
takeaway.
meaningful. I really like that too. I'm glad you're bringing that up because a lot of people think that the earmark of a great family law attorney is the person who could be the rudest, the loudest, the most insulting, disrespectful person that, just cheats and bends the rules and does things like that. But the truth of the matter is that the judges favor those who have credibility,
Right.
And I think we heard that loud and clear last night.
Absolutely.
So that was good. So let's talk about Domestic Violence Awareness Month. I did a little history this morning on what it is because I've known that it's been around, but I've never really found out when it started or anything. So I found this blurb, and it states that the Domestic Violence Awareness Month evolved from the Day of Unity in October 1981. The intent was to connect advocates across the nation who were working to end violence against women and their children. The Day of Unity soon became an entire week devoted to a range of activities conducted at the local, state, and national levels. The activities conducted were as varied and diverse as the program sponsors, but had common themes. Mourning those who have died because of domestic violence, celebrating those who have survived, and connecting those who work to end violence. In October of 1987, the first Domestic Violence Awareness Month was observed. And I think that it's interesting because it's been since 1987 that we've had this. A lot of people think that this is like a new awareness, in our society. But as an old timer, just celebrating my 60th birthday, and as you know, I've had a long, really a fun career in law enforcement, and then as an attorney. I mean, I could tell you that in the 80s, this was a very hot topic. There was some very national stories out there. And as a police officer, we were really confronted with this. There was changing, and there has been changes through the years, but it's amazing to me how people feel like this is something new and the problem is still here. So let me start off with this. How bad is the situation now? You're a family law attorney, and before you answer that, I think that the folks out there need to know that we family law attorneys are truly at the forefront of domestic violence. I love my friends who are still in the DA's office that are, protecting people by prosecuting, but we see these things right when they're happening. And we see a lot of the cases that don't end up being filed, which we think should be, and things that are called abuse, and maybe, there's not enough corroborating evidence, but we're with the families all the time. So you now have been practicing for well over 10 years in family law. Is the problem still here?
The problem is still here, and the problem has so many layers. One of the layers is the fact that abuse as we know it or as we've defined it has evolved over time. So what the judges used to label abuse is no longer the case. There's new case law. You don't need a black eye to go into court and to get a restraining order. The second layer is, as you mentioned, the evidentiary layer. Just because you can't prove it doesn't mean it didn't happen. What do you do for your clients? And I want to acknowledge that a third layer, and that is, as the lawyer, how do you sift through and weigh your own client's credibility to figure out if this is a real allegation and what corroboration they have? Because obviously, when you try a case, the as close to the truth as possible is going to come out. So you obviously need to vet all of that with your client before you file anything. Multiple layers.
Yeah. Yeah. And so the problem's still here with us, and there's a lot of work that goes into these matters. When people don't agree to receive a restraining order, which is probably 98% of the case, there's some preparation that goes along with that, right?
Absolutely. As far as not receiving the restraining order,
Yeah, let's say that your opposing party says, "Hey, I'm not going to agree to being or being issued a restraining order. I'm going to fight it." You're into an evidentiary hearing. It's a mini trial, right? Or sometimes a lengthy trial, right?
it used to be when I started practicing law, it used to be a in and out in 2 hours.
Yeah.
And the last several that I've done have been multiple day trials. Because everyone wants their due process, wants to call their witnesses, so it does definitely turn into a bigger type of case because the TRO process is really designed for the pro per litigant. It's paperwork in and out. They almost always get granted, but all of the work comes with the evidentiary hearing that happens about 3 weeks later.
Yeah,
So-
there's a short period of time to prepare in a lot of cases because there's a statutory uh, right to have your hearing done quickly, right?
That's right. Don, and I also want to mention on one of our last points is I think the research is evolving and changing. So once upon a time, people would say, "Oh, well, you're not really scared of him." In fact, when I started practicing law 12 years ago, one of the things we would often say is, "Oh, well, if you want a restraining order, then why is it that, you did this, that, and the other? Why is it that you guys went on a family vacation? And why did you guys go to dinner?" I think the family law attorneys and the judges are catching up to the psychological research behind domestic violence and the cycle of abuse. So I think those arguments are now less persuasive as we're understanding that individuals don't report. It takes a victim, 7 to 10 times to attempt to leave a relationship before they actually leave. So I think we are catching up to the research on
Yeah.
these areas.
Yeah. Hopefully, we're slowly educating the bench on that first point that you've made, that victims of domestic violence, so long as they intend on staying in the marriage, they're going to continue to do things that married people do. And I hate when we hear the argument that she or he's not fearful because, look, they were out to dinner, after the alleged incident, or they were having sex. Recently I had a case where that allegation was made, and it just burned me badly. Of course, in closing arguments, I was able to let the judge know how I felt about that evidence, and fortunately, we prevailed. But those arguments are still out there. It's almost like a very crude way to try to defend somebody by saying, look, she's not afraid because she stayed in the relationship, or she
Right.
did something like that.
Well, that's interesting on that last point, Don. There was a recent case, and it was important enough that the case was published, and it was exactly on that point. It was argued that because a woman continued to have sex with her abuser, that she should not get a restraining order against him. The published opinion, which is now law, says that there was a pattern of abuse. There was a cycle, and part of that cycle was, reconciliation, sex, and then the cycle continued with another fight and another domestic violence. So that is now something that we can cite and talk to the courts about.
So when I was a prosecutor, I prosecuted a lot of domestic violence cases, and I had the luxury of assuming that the jury didn't know anything about this cycle of violence that you just spoke of. And we put these exhibit charts out with the cycle of the wheel, and I'd be able to kind of like be a professor and talk about that. But as family law attorneys, we're almost insulting the judge if we try to teach them the basics like that, and we might get shut down. Unfortunately, some of the judges might not still understand the cycle of violence. Could you explain it to our audience about what we're talking about what happens between the abuser and the victim, as before, after, and all of the stuff that we see?
Well, luckily, some of the education that I received was from our judges in the Los Angeles Superior Court, and I received it, so I assume all the judicial bench received this information. But essentially, a period where there was a big fight, there's a honeymoon phase, everything is great and wonderful, and then there's a tension buildup, and then that builds up to the next fight, and then the cycle continues. That's the bottom line. That's
And we see
essentially
this in
it.
real life, don't we? This isn't just a theory.
Absolutely not. We see it. You recognize the patterns when you speak to people, when you meet these clients.
Yeah, I think that what's interesting is that when we get these cases, one thing that's real obvious is the power and control component of that cycle, because that seems to be a predominant thing in all the cases we see. Can you give us some examples of what you would see in a power and control type of relationship?
Well, I mean, it's amazing how someone walks into your office and they're telling you this thing that's happening that they can't really grasp or hold. It's an intangible, but we see it so much. And when you tell them that you get it, they are just amazed. But that power and control cycle that happens during marriage, take that and then take it to a situation where people are getting divorced and they're now sharing custody. That's when you start to see that the children are being used, that the child support checks are being withheld. The child support checks are being, 10 days late or placed under a pot, or, games, those types of games. Or where you see, the children being used as messengers, or one of the parents is withholding information about the children, or worse, withholding the children. It's using them to control the other side or to incite a reaction from them.
Yeah. What I've seen in some of the recent cases I've had, it's just examples, is one spouse telling the other spouse that you cannot go out into the community and serve on boards, or you're not going to be able to use the telephone. I mean, there's some insane cases. There's a published case that happened here in Pasadena where the husband was, or actually they weren't married. The boyfriend was monitoring the woman as she was attending the local community college, and making sure that she wasn't speaking to other men.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, and it just seems like that's the root of the problem, and it comes from almost like an insecurity. Somebody, that little child voice in somebody's head is telling them that they need to control the other person. Otherwise, they're going to lose the love or something like that. Not a psychologist, but I've done this long enough to go, man, it's really a sad situation.
Absolutely.
And it's really sad when somebody's subject to the power and control like that.
Yep, absolutely.
A lot of times it builds up to, like you said, then it gets into that tension stage and then lashing out in violence. So we've been talking about violence a lot. In California, the codes in the family code is very broad with respect to how to get a restraining order. And you don't necessarily have to have what we call violence, battering somebody or something like that. Can you explain what the code would require to get a restraining order?
Well, there's the obvious, if there's physical assault, sexual assault, that's pretty much a slam dunk restraining order. But our code also says that a physical injury is not required. And our code also says that any behavior that can be enjoined, that's abuse. So what does that include? That includes threatening behavior, stalking behavior, blocking movements, and disturbing someone's peace. So the disturbing of the peace has been a hot topic in case law in our cases, because, what does that really mean? There's case law about, using someone's password to get into their bank account. They're not right. They're not standing right next to you, but the fact that you've done that disturbs their peace. And actually, there's another case, a recent case, where the violence or the domestic violence didn't even happen in front of the person. It was someone going to the ex-girlfriend's house, and that was deemed to have disturbed the peace of the other party, and to be grounds for a restraining order. So, it's pretty broad. And I've also seen cases, I've actually been a part of a case many, many years ago where, an object was thrown at the wall, and I represented the woman that was standing there, and the object flew right past her. It was argued, well, it didn't hit her, but how did that person feel when that object was flying in their direction? Did she felt like that object was intended for her? So it's also looking at the state of mind of the victim of domestic violence. So it's a broad range, and I think that I've heard judicial officers say that the showing is not very high, but certainly you do have to work on corroboration.
So great segue for the next question that I have is, if you were speaking to people out there who are watching this podcast that are subject to domestic violence, they're victims, what would you say that they should do? Some of the basic things that they should at least consider doing in order to protect themselves.
Well, I guess there are different levels of domestic violence. Certainly, there are, those where someone is fearful for their life. I think my advice would be different for those people. But if it's a different type of domestic violence, like some of the disturbing of the peace, I think one of the things they should do is document it. Also they should send like a written communication to the other side and say and tell them, so it's crystal clear, when you do this it scares me, when you do this it makes me fearful. And there's no way around that. If that person continues that conduct knowing that it causes, I think that's disturbing the peace, and I think that that is evidence. So certainly documentation.
What about taking photographs of things?
Photographs are important. When we get down to going to court, I always want to know, well, I want proof of when you took this photograph. And it's important to take the photograph close in time to the incident.
Injuries, right?
Absolutely. Injuries, if it rises to the level, there should be, police reports and, even getting an emergency restraining order.
Yeah, I think that people should know that, we love representing people. I mean, because, that's why we became attorneys, right? To bring justice to this world and to protect people. But people got to help us a little bit, and we're always looking for what we call corroborating evidence. When it comes to being a victim, taking photographs of the injuries or destruction around the home or something like that would be very important. Making police reports, like you said, calling the police first, right? I mean, that's really important.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So with respect to consequences in this day and age, people that commit domestic violence, I think that the message is out there. I could see it. I could see that men are calling the police when they're victims as well. I think that people know that when the police come, somebody is likely to get arrested. It's no secret out there anymore that it's a law, and people are going to have to pay some consequences. In the family code, what kind of consequences do people suffer if they're found to be, if there's findings of domestic violence?
Well, even at that initial temporary restraining order, I mean, which those are regularly filed, they're in place for 3 weeks. The perpetrator's name is going to be placed in the police database, the CLET system, and if that individual is pulled over, that's going to come up when the police, look that up. And I also think it impacts when someone is traveling. It may come up in the CLET system, but there are also consequences. There's a presumption in law that a perpetrator of domestic violence, once that person has been found to be a perpetrator of domestic violence, presumption in law that it's not in the child's best interest for that person to have legal or physical custody of the children. It doesn't mean they're not going to have visitation, but it's presumptively that person, custody is going to go to the other parent. There are ways to overcome that presumption, as we've seen. People, go to domestic batterer intervention courses, anger management courses, therapy, and they present all of that to the court and also try to demonstrate to the courts what I tell my clients when they're in that situation. Be ready to talk to the court about what you learned, how you're different now than you were then, how you deal with a situation now, what tools are you using, and there better be a very peaceful history between you and the other spouse as far as visitation exchanges. Because if this person goes back to court 6 months later and says, I did all of these things, but then the other side reports, well, by the way, he cursed me out at the exchange, or she did something else, then the court's not really going to believe that person, and you're not going to be able to overcome the presumption. So that's, I think it's important to also talk about the other side of this, and that is the person that is defending against the restraining order, or that has the restraining order against them. What now? So
yeah. And one other presumption under the law that folks may not know, but if you're the perpetrator of domestic violence, you're not going to collect, you're not likely to receive spousal support, and that's gender neutral, and people need to be aware of that as well.
Well, I recently looked into that, and I've always kind of used that, rule of thumb that, oh, well, no spousal support. But looking closer at the code, it says that when you're looking at a spousal support analysis, whether there's domestic violence is one of the many factors to look at. Arguably, it's a very persuasive factor, but it's a balancing test.
Sure,
So I
sure.
think the other side, if I were on the other side of that, I'd be trying to balance those factors out.
Unless
But
there's a conviction.
unless there's a conviction, that's right. If there's
Yeah.
a conviction, it's I
Pretty
think
solid. Yeah.
black and white.
Yeah. Okay. So, finally, with consequences of domestic violence, I mean, the most important negative consequence that I could think of are the children. You already touched on that. Children being present during domestic violence, children seeing one of their parents get injured, all the fighting that goes on in front of them, all of the verbal abuse, things of that nature. Do you see a lot of that in the cases?
I see a lot of that, and that is by definition child abuse. And interesting, this reminds me of a new case that says that committing abuse on the child in front of the other parent was grounds for a domestic violence restraining order for the protection of that parent. So it goes both ways. Domestic violence between parents in front of the child is child abuse, and abusing the child in front of the other parent is domestic violence.
Yeah.
So
And I think also that we know, it's just common sense that if a child is raised in an environment where domestic violence is unreported and it's seemingly okay, people making excuses, it's that little secret that the family keeps, that child may repeat that behavior when that child becomes an adult. I know that when I was in the military, I encountered a gentleman serving in Korea, and he described to me the violence that he was committing on his girlfriend. And he said it without a blink. I mean, it was like it was his right. It was so disgusting, and it occurred to me that somehow in his head it was ingrained from a long time ago, and stuff. So this kind of leads me to the question today of what I wanted to pose and kind of discuss with you, and that is that how do we eradicate the problem or seriously change the system? I know that through the years there's been a lot of laws passed, and that's good. I've definitely experienced that. But what do you think our society should do in order to eradicate the problem, or at least make it so small that we don't have the level of domestic violence that we see today?
well, I think what brought us here today is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. I think that's important. I also think it's important to teach young people about this in school. So you hear all the time individuals say, well, I didn't even realize that was domestic violence, or I didn't realize that was abuse. And I think that education should happen kind of at a more formative time, so that you know young men and young women understand what should be acceptable and unacceptable for
Yeah,
them.
yeah, I agree.
So I think that's something in addition to the awareness and the research. I think educating young people is important.
Yeah, I'm really a strong believer that we've got to change attitudes about this phenomenon. When I was younger, someone told me, you don't lay your hands on an adult, especially a woman or anything like that. And it was always ingrained in me. And the thought of hitting somebody in my family is just, it's counter to what I was raised. And it's just so shocking that I see that. When we talk about talking to the kids, it seems like as a society we've got to let the youth know that, right, that is wrong. You just don't do that. And maybe teach them. The case that I had recently, the child, after the domestic violence incident occurred and the father was removed from the home, the child hit my client, the victim, and children get upset, by divorces and by domestic violence. And it seemed to me that the child was kind of like acting out because of that. So my client told a good friend of what had happened. And that good friend was a victim of domestic violence, a long-time victim. She went to the home, the friend went to the home and scolded the child, and it was tried to be, in court there was some conversation about, how dare, they yell at the kid and stuff like that. But that was a classic example of what parents need to do and adults need to do. You need to tell these kids, that is absolutely wrong. You do not hit, people like that. Do you agree with that?
I do. I think, it starts at a very young age where, when we're talking about very, very young children, it's almost natural. And as, I think parents obviously teach their children, but if a child that is, 12, 13, 14 is engaging in that behavior, if it is not aggressively addressed, that child is going to be 35 engaging in the same behavior and is going to end up in jail, or is going to, end up, being a perpetrator of domestic violence.
Yeah, and that goes along with, losing your temper, throwing things around the house, putting your fist through the doors and things like that. I mean, kids see that, and kids admire both parents. They want a role model. And if that's acceptable of how you express yourself, they learn that. And I really think it's about attitudes. I know we've got the passage of laws, and every year we see tougher and tougher laws against domestic violence. This year, apparently, there is going to be an extension of the statute of limitations for misdemeanors to 5 years. It's like the DUI laws. Every year you see more and more laws passed, but I really don't think that that's in and of itself the way that we're going to eradicate the problem. So, talking about consequences, just a classic example is there was a baseball player. As you know, I'm a hardcore Dodger fan. Okay, sorry, folks back in Chicago. I've given up the Chicago Cubs and White Sox, and I'm with the winning team now. So the Los Angeles Dodgers pitcher Julio Urias was arrested earlier this year. He was only 22 years old at the time. And I got to tell you that I was there when he had his debut, and this kid could pitch, and I was so darn proud of him, man. It was like you see these young kids get into the major leagues, and it's like, oh my gosh, man, how beautiful that is. What a career. And this guy, unfortunately, was arrested for domestic violence in Los Angeles, and it did impact his career to the extent that he was suspended and things of that nature. So, I guess this is an example, a classic example of how it really is across the board. Athletes, people that don't have jobs, people that are highly intelligent, people that are rich, people that are poor. It really still is happening across the board. Would you agree with that?
I would absolutely agree with that. And as for some reason, the media has made this, kind of something that they focus on, and you see it all the time. And when it comes to these individuals that are, famous, the consequences go beyond, consequences that perhaps would impact our clients, wouldn't impact these individuals. But on the other hand, they're, millions of people are scrutinizing them, and they're losing, contracts, and they're sometimes, because of the bad publicity, they're losing their livelihood. They're unable to continue doing what they love, or professional athletes. So
yeah, you're seeing that a lot more with the professional athletes really getting dinged hard on this. So let's just lighten it a little bit. So I want to end today's conversation about Domestic Violence Awareness Month by bringing your attention to a couple of women, or actually a few women, who have tried to do it their own way. So the first, there's an article, and this was an article that was published on June 21st. It's about a woman who went across the country riding her horse to raise awareness of domestic violence. And the article starts off with Meredith Cherry holds Apollo as he rests his head on her chest, Monday, June 10th in Oakville, Indiana. Cherry bought Apollo as a gift to herself after leaving her 12-year abusive relationship. Apollo was green, broke, meaning he had basic training, and Cherry was a new horsewoman. So here's this woman, she was in an abusive relationship, and she takes that horse, and she later on in the article says she's gone through every single state of the union trying to raise awareness for domestic violence. Now, wow. When she came to California, I didn't see Sherry. Did you?
I absolutely did not see Sherry. I would have remembered.
In fact, there wasn't too much publicity about this, so maybe there's better ways. So let's turn to the second way here. And this is a group of ladies. They're belly dancers that are fighting domestic violence. And the article states that there were 6 area belly dancers who shimmied their way down the strip Saturday afternoon in an attempt to raise awareness about the signs of domestic violence. Now, we've seen a lot of these articles. I think a couple of shows ago, there was men that were wearing pink high-heeled shoes, and they were walking in the shoes of victims and things like that. What do you think about the effectiveness of this?
Well, we're talking about it.
Okay.
We're talking about it. It's one layer to the many, many layers and things that can be done. But
You
it
always
can't hurt.
take the mature viewpoint. That is because I was going to discard this, but what you're saying essentially is that you got to do it your own way, right?
Well, think about it. Maybe perhaps these women, these belly dancers, maybe they're victims, and they have a camaraderie, and they're encouraging someone to say, hey, if I, come out with this, and, there may be consequences in my family, but I have a support group, I have a support network, and I can join these women. And
you are brilliant. That's what I love about you. You're a great arguer. No wonder why you're such an awesome attorney. Well, Casey, thank you very, very much for being here and humoring me with all my crazy questions and stuff. But I love having you here on our podcast, and I look forward to seeing you next time. And thank you for joining us on Exhibit A.
Thank you.